Hello, everybody. Welcome to Friday, another Talk Money with Tom show. Today, we're going to be trying to help you with your retirement, especially the financial aspects of it. We want to answer questions, so please feel free to send those questions in. You can send them in two different ways here during the live show. Ask Tom at talkmoneywithtom.com. You can send that in anytime. Send it in during the week if you want, so we can do some research. But you can also, if you're signed in on the channel here, put it right into the chat, and we can try to answer questions live via the email or the chat. So please send those in. We get a lot of questions that come up during some of our client sessions too that we'll kind of share with everybody some of the answers that we see too. So of course we have the channel for a reason. We try to really up the educational level in the area of retirement, retirement planning, the tax planning that you might want to do during retirement, how to manage the money, those types of things. And so you can subscribe, hit the little bell button to get notified when new stuff comes in. Look at what we have on there already, a couple thousand videos now at this point. So, and then of course, if you just want to talk to Ethan and I, we can set that up too. There's a link to our website here on the channel, and on the website up in the corner is a button, looks just like this, a book appointment button. And you can set up a time, 30 minutes to meet with Ethan and I, and we'll answer your questions directly. So look forward to being able to talk to everybody today, and I want to thank you all for joining us. I do like to start off every show with kind of a summary of what was happening in the market this week. There's a lot going on. It's incredible. I mean, there's a pretty good sized list of things to talk about almost every week with all the activity that's happening with tariffs and what have you too. So let's start off just with the chart. Things are pretty good in the market, and they really are. We'll talk about some of the nuances and what have you, but we hit an all-time high yesterday, and I've reiterated this a few times over the last couple of weeks, but the first half of July, if we go back to 1928, is the best half of a month, right? And so it usually it's because of the end of the first half of the year, and that's 2 weeks. There's this wall of money that comes in and drives the market up. The average peak in July is the 17th, which was yesterday, and we hit an all-time high yesterday. So it'll be kind of interesting to see going forward. Last year we had a little drop off, started on the 16th of July. So, and we're heading into the softer time of the year. August isn't a terrible time. Actually, it does okay. September is, the only month going back to 1928 that actually has a negative for both halves of September for. So, there's some seasonality that plays into this also. All right, so let's talk about some of the things, that are really important here, I think. This is kind of an interesting chart. Okay, this goes back to the 1800s, and basically this is the average tariff. And this is a little bit dated. It says it's 14.5%. It's actually 18% right now is the average with the newer tariffs. So these charts aren't keeping up with some of the new stuff that's coming along. But I wanted to point this out because I think it's kind of fascinating to me. There's a few things in this chart that are really interesting. Number one is, if we go through with the tariffs that we have in place now for August 1st, we will be higher than 20%. Mm-hmm. And so it'll be the highest tariffs we've had since we've had income tax. So the high tariffs back in the 1800s and very early 1900s, we didn't have any federal income tax. The federal government kind of gathered its money from tariffs. Over a period of time, people started to realize that you're better off doing a tax and having more free trade, and you'd get more global growth and country growth. And obviously that's not what we're doing now. And so there's a couple of things that I think are very interesting about this chart. First of all, one of the things that keeps getting talked about is the fact that maybe these tariffs can offset the deficit. Okay, so for example, the projected deficit for this big beautiful bill by the Congressional Budget Office was $3.3 trillion over the next 10 years. And at the current tariff rates, the Yale Budget Lab guesstimates maybe $2.7 trillion could come in over the next 10 years. Okay, look at the chart. Show me where it was up for 10 years, right?
Fortunately, there's no period of time where it's been peaking for a prolonged period of time or
No,
maintaining it.
no. Look at there because it's making little peaks, which is really important in terms of what that means to me. First of all, there is no 10-year period. So why are we bothering? I mean, in the history of the tariffs, going back to the 1800s, we've never had a 10-year period where we could hold up tariffs at the level that they're at now to get this $2.7 trillion over the next 10 years. They'd have to stay up there. That has never happened. Okay, so the other thing I think that's important and fascinating to me is that high tariffs don't work. Otherwise, they would stay up there, right? You can see a long period of time here where tariffs were low, it went sideways, no problems. But whenever it got really high, it peaks out and comes right back down. If it was working and the government was gathering all this money, they wouldn't bring it down. So why are they bringing it down? Because it doesn't work, right? And so there's a couple of thought processes that I have about this, and that is very likely that the tariff peaks that we're going into now won't be here for very long. And so that's where the market might be looking, right? I mean, tariffs are only really can really destroy the economy if they're up there for a while. They certainly contributed to what happened in 1930. The market had already crashed in 1929, and adding tariffs, it was an attempt to kind of help. American unemployment was at 6% at that time. They were trying to protect the job market and keep that number back down, maybe get it down to 4% or something in those lines. And it actually went up to 25% within 18 months. But that was in a really weak time frame too, so it's kind of interesting to see. But that's the piece on number one. These tariffs are great. No, they're not. They haven't been. All right. Why would they reduce them like they did in 1930s? We're at 19.8%, and that starts to come down fairly quickly from there. Every one of these high tariffs are peaks, and that basically comes down from there, because there's this understanding that, hey, this is creating other problems that are worse than getting the money. So if we're going to get this 2.7 trillion but lose 5 trillion in lost whatever in the economy, then we're better off having lower tariffs because we can net a higher revenue to the overall government.
So the idea is that if these tariffs could cause some sort of recession or demand destruction, and if there's enough demand destruction, those projections of tariffs aren't strong enough to kind of cover the deficit.
Yes, and these peaking tariffs, if you go back in time and take a look, they had economic repercussions. And so now you have, Jamie Dimon, right, who has the head of J.P. Morgan Chase, They have unbelievable access to data to see what's happening and what have you. I love listening to people like that because, unparalleled, like data that they have, that they can see different trends and what have you. And so what he was talking about this week was private credit. And this relates to tariffs because he talked about even a minor recession, when you have a lot of loans out, can cause a big chunk of those loans to default, which then creates this kind of cascading effect. And that's what happened. And he talked about that. That's what happened in 2008.
Yeah, essentially, you can only lend mortgages to so many credit-worthy people.
Right.
And so either you have to cut your standards are to get more people to generate more business, or you just run out of opportunities. And I think private credit is running that same issue.
Yeah,
exactly. There's only so many good businesses to buy and invest in and help out.
That's right.
You can't just keep buying.
And then because the money's there and it's sloshing around and you got to get it out the door, that's exactly what happened in 2008, right? They just kept, and pretty soon, lower and lower quality loans were going out for people that couldn't afford that loan, really. And so that's happening very likely in the private credit area. Again, this is all hidden in a way. There is no big exchange to see the private credit. That's just coming from, from this gentleman who has some access to all this. And the way it relates to tariffs, because historically tariffs have caused a slowdown in the economy. And so you're going to get a slowdown in the economy. And that's what I've been saying all along. Maybe Trump can, make that thing a peak and come back down very quickly. I mean, there's some advantages to having one person who can decide versus in 1930, it was the entire Congress had to decide. It did take a while for that to come back down. But Trump could, see things happening and see the negativity and move back down. But the problem is that, he has to be able to somehow do that before it's too late. right? And so we've talked about that, and I think that's the biggest reason that we have a third of our stock market exposure not in the stock market, just because those things can happen so rapidly, right? So I want to keep some powder dry there as far as that goes. We still, I think that's a good balance right now. 2/3 says yes, we're going. The market's going to continue to go. We might have rate cuts, and we'll talk about some of that here too towards the end. But anyway, I think that's where tariffs relate. It's just the possibility of slowing things down and something catching, that slowdown in a way that was not expected and turns into something bigger, right? We're coming off a period of cheap money. Usually that means something is out there running around where maybe shouldn't be. That's what we normally see, right? So then we had the CPI report that came out this week. So this is going back to, the 1950s. And this is CPI all the way through. And you can see the big peaks there in, 75 and 1980. That was the huge inflation. But you can also see the big peak that we're just coming off of here, in 2022. Where CPI got, up above 7.5% here. And so if you look at that right now,
It's not bad.
it's not bad, really. I mean, look at where it is right now. It's spent a ton of time in that same range for a really long time, from 1982 to all the way through to, to the 2022 thing. And so we're at 2.7%, right? The CPI is the growth. However, the market dropped on this particular report this week. And a couple of things. Number one, if you look at it month over month, right? So here's the last 12 months. You can see April, and it was kind of a low point there. And then now May, it's coming up, and June, it's coming up. So June was 0.3% higher, right, than May.
Yeah, and they were thinking that the expectation was 2.6.
Yeah, which is fine. It's higher, right? So it's going the wrong direction. However, if you look closely at this chart, you'll see that it went up all the way from September to January of this, last year to this year. And so that had nothing to do with tariffs or, that just happens. There is a volatility in these numbers that just comes along. And so, you look at that again, historically, long term, you look at that in the last 12 months, because we've had a lot of times where CPI has gone up and then eventually just kind of fell back down over the last couple of, years, and it's been slowly working its way down. However, if you really dig behind the scenes and you take a look, this is what people were worried about. And this is the tariff-related sectors. And there's more. I just got a few here. So again, the overall price increase for June was 0.3%. That annualizes out to 3.6, which is a lot higher than 2.7, which is what we did the last 12 months. So again, there's some push there, but volatility on the monthly numbers happen all the time. However, household furnishings are actually up 1%, almost 3 times, a little bit more than 3 times higher than the overall average. And inside of that are some really big ones. So window and floor coverings up 4.2%, which is a record. That's for 1 month, okay?
Yeah, and these are a lot of the ones that have exposure to tariffs.
Yep, that's exactly right. And so that's, because they're being imported. Appliances up 1.9%, again, just for the month. Recreational goods overall, significantly higher inflation for the month than the average at 0.8. But if you look inside that, there's some big ones. Audio and video equipment up 1.1, sporting goods 1.4, toys up 1.7, and then toys 1.8, apparel's up 1.7. So again, these are things. This is what the market's worried about, right? You're going to see these segments, that really drive things. Now, overall, you can see CPI still doing okay if some of the other areas continue to soften.
Yeah, so shelter, which has been very sticky, is starting to soften. Other stuff like hotels are softening too. So you can see other sectors kind of softening, where you can see maybe it's also a tightening of the belt of the consumer too.
Yeah, exactly. They did have retail sales that came out for the week, and it was quite good. Although they did attribute a big chunk of the gain to the actual increased cost of those goods. But the consumer's still out there spending. And I think, again, I've been saying this for a while, the irony of these tariffs is that they've actually helped things. First-time unemployment claims came through this week. They were down again for the 5th time in a row. Still 221,000, so not, really low, but still, not bad in a normal overall course of things. You have this, situation with retail sales doing well. And again, I think, it's driving people to buy stuff, right? Because if I look at that and I know that I need window and floor coverings and I just see it's grew 4.2%, it could grow a lot more, I might go out and get my window and floor coverings early for my project,
Mhm.
when I'm building a house,
Yeah.
if I'm a contractor, whatever it is, right? If I'm building homes right now, I'm gonna go out and try to buy some stuff now, right? Because I see these numbers, and so that makes things look great until the other side hits, because a lot of that stuff can be front end loaded. It might have been purchased maybe in the fall. That's not going to be purchased in the fall, right? Because it was purchased now.
Yeah, and if the prices go up enough, there's going to just be a demand destruction where
Yep.
people stop buying.
Yep, that's right. And so that's where, you see some of the uncertainty that's out there and what have you, kind of combining with this whole situation of, what's behind the scenes. Okay, so then the last thing we'll talk about really is just Chairman Powell, because that was a big piece of this week also. So there was a report that came out that an insider in the White House said that Chairman Powell's, firing was going to happen.
Mhm.
There was a letter that had been prepared and all these things. The market dropped about 0.7% pretty much immediately. And then the bond market actually dropped also, so the yield started going up. There's a chart of the 30-year yield, which is the most sensitive one, but it went up quite drastically, with that, I guess we'll call it a rumor, as far as that goes. And then Trump was asked directly about it, and he said, no, we're not going to do that, right? And the market kind of came back around. It still ended up slightly down for the day, but nothing like it was. So. But this is an ongoing thing, and so I think this is going to be kind of important. There's a couple of areas. First of all, it's never happened. The irony of it, in my opinion, is you fire the Federal Reserve Chairman to try to get somebody in there to lower rates. Okay, they can only lower one rate, and that's assuming they can get the board to go along. After you
Mhm.
just fired the chairman, you still have the board. They still have to agree on this rate cut. And so let's say that they are able to do this rate cut. Well, the market is going to have already chosen a situation where, hey, for the first time, I think in history, a Fed Reserve governor was interfered with to the point of being fired. And the U.S. would start to see less trust coming across the whole basis. And yields would actually go up. Okay, so borrowing costs would go up in that environment, even if they were trying to lower the Fed funds rate, because the Fed funds rate is only the amount that they charge to large banks, and so the market sets the rest. Now, usually that follows the Fed funds rate,
Mhm.
but if you just fired the Federal Reserve Chairman, you're probably going to see a situation where borrowing costs go up. He's going to get exactly the opposite of what he
Yeah,
was.
the foreign investors or just the general investor
Mhm.
doesn't like when someone interferes with the rates. They
Right.
don't like political interference.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why it's supposed to be independent. It's why it's the gold standard. It's a big piece of this whole what we're doing here. Unfortunately, is we're kind of taking away probably one of the most important things the U.S. has, which is this safety aspect. So when everything's falling apart, people go to the U.S., they go to the dollar, they go to treasuries, right? And we're starting to see some of that erode with the tariff policies. It's kind of the anger around those. And the situation of firing the Fed, I think, would just fan those flames as far as that goes. So I think it would be a really bad thing to do. The market might recover from it. The bond market might really have trouble with it in the end, because that's where that's where the rates are set. Anyway, that was a piece of what happened this week. We'll see. I wouldn't be surprised to. At this point in time, they keep talking about, we'll be able to change out anyway in May. I don't know. It's coming on so strongly all the time. How do we get to May?
Usually
That's a
where
long ways
there's
off.
smoke, there's a fire. And
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it could be just using this as a testing of the waters.
Yeah, I will say though, in the end, even if they don't, fire Powell before May, they will get to put somebody in there who's going to want to cut rates pretty heavily. So that'll be pretty. That could be good, I suppose. tariffs can slow down the economy. They have in the past, and so cutting rates in advance of that slowdown could be a good thing. It could cause inflation. Ray Alioto's a hedge fund manager, has been running around talking about how the Fed needs to stay independent, and that the risk is this lowering of rates and then creating kind of this hyperinflation. But you can't get inflation on a normal basis if the economy's weak. In other words, if consumers are confused and don't know, the uncertainty's too high, and you start to stop spending because things are getting too expensive. Ironically, you still have prices going up because of the tariffs, but it won't be because of lower interest rates, right? So I don't know. I do feel like there might be some room to do some lowering of interest rates here because I think the economy is going to start to slow down. But the Fed has said that they want to see hard data first. Boy, it's probably going to be too late. I bet you the recession is already kind of happening, and then that brings into play some of these other potential risks.
Yeah,
So,
I think the Fed is very cognizant of the 80s and the basically
Yes.
inflation's
Yes.
running wild again after they've tried to tame it. So
yep.
they're really going they rather have recession than.
But this is different in a way. That was energy driven. In that 7-year period, oil went from $4 to $40 a barrel, right, which is unbelievable, 10 times the cost for a barrel of oil. And this is tariff driven. So what the Fed would be concerned about is kind of that supply and demand. So if demand is dropping down, even though prices are going up because of tariffs, if demand is coming down because of the softness and all the other things we talked about, you can lower rates into that situation and not have the traditional inflation, which is supply and demand, where the demand shifts way up. Potentially. I mean, that's why I do think there's room for a couple of rate cuts. And September's now up to 57%. This week it got down to 52% chance of a rate cut. But we saw 70%, a little bit more than a week ago. So the CPI report kind of some of the things I pointed out there. Basically, you're starting to see some concerns in that particular market. So anyway, that's what we have for this week. There's a lot going on, a lot happening, a week by week basis. So we'll keep talking about it, and appreciate everybody kind of listening to the summary. Let's get on to our first question.
So what should I know about the one big beautiful bill, basically the big tax bill that was passed a couple weeks?
Yeah, so this has been coming up quite often within the clientele. Just what does this mean? We all hear the headline stuff about cuts to Medicaid and SNAP and getting to write off your jet and those kind of things. But let's give you a quick kind of summary of some of the things that are happening. You can try to see what parts of these would apply to you. And it's a little bit dense, but let's just try. Okay, so this is the overall tax table. So this is the biggest cost of this bill was to keep, and this is the same tax table we already have.
Yep.
Okay. It goes from 10 to 37%. There's a big, 24% covers a lot of people. For example, up to 383,000, on a joint basis. And so this was a $3.5 trillion cost to keep this table in place or keep the current tax code in place.
Yeah, and so with the previous tax bill, it was temporary.
Right.
This basically makes it permanent.
Yeah, which I think either party would have ended up doing this.
Yeah, I think you could have done that. I think one way they could always fix it to generate more revenue is just add another tax bracket on top.
Oh, yeah, I think that parties would have handled how they got the money to keep this bracket in place differently. There was even some talk about having a 40% bracket to be added to this, even by Trump himself. Yeah, exactly. There would have probably been some other ways to go about finding that deficit, but I think either party would have tried to keep the current tax code in place, only because if you let it expire like it was supposed to at the end of the year, it's the largest tax increase in history.
It's going to be painful for everybody. And they could have just changed the brackets by shifting some people, the higher end brackets up a little bit too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, there was lots of different ways of doing it. Elections matter. They get to do it the way that they want to do it. So now, again, a little small here, but standard deduction moved up a little, was $15,000 each. Now it's 15,750.
Yeah, and so it's also indexed for inflation, so it'll go up
Right.
each year. But essentially, they gave you 750, and if you're jointly filing, you get an extra 1,500
Yeah.
just on the standard deduction. Um, Personal exemptions, I don't think many people remember this, but prior to the tax or the 2017 tax bill, basically you get 4,500 per for yourself, and then each dependent would be another little bit, but those are basically been repealed and removed.
Yeah, so those are out of there. There's a senior deduction now, $6,000 per person,
So,
but it does have a phase out.
yeah, so this is kind of the senior bonus deduction for anyone that's 65 and older. For the next 4 years, you'll get an extra 6,000 per senior.
Yeah.
There's a standard senior deduction is 2,000 if you're 65 and older or blind, and then if you're as a joint filing, it's 3,200, and so this is just on top of that. So there's going to be a lot of basically if you're 65 and older, you're going to have a pretty big standard deduction that a lot
Yes.
of people will not need to itemize.
Yeah, so if you're a joint filer, you got 31,500 is your standard deduction, and if you're over 65, we can keep the enhanced deduction of the 3,200. So you add that on to there, and now you get to add 12,000 for the two of you for the six on top of that. So now you're at 43,500,
46 something.
46,000 plus. Okay, so that's just real quick on that. I think that's kind of amazing. So if you're over 65 and you're, not able to itemize because you don't have 46,000 plus dollars worth of itemized deductions, you're going to be filing a pretty simple tax return, which is great. But if you have a mortgage, right, you're not going to be able to write it off because you can't itemize, right? And so you got to take a look at those mortgages, and see what rate you're paying, is whether you should be accelerating the payoff of those because now you can't write them off anymore, or those types of things. Most of the rates that I've seen are still good enough to keep, because it's still cheap
Yeah.
money. But it's not as cheap without the write-off. Okay, then the SALT deduction, this is a big one for an area like this, went from 10,000 to 40,000. So you can write off your state, local taxes, property taxes, those types of things, up to now 40,000. But again, that has a phase out. It starts off at $500,000, and if you make more than that, it drops down to zero, basically, or back down to 10,000.
Yeah, it'll never go below 10,000,
Right.
but you won't have that, and it's only going to last till 2029, and so
That's right. This is temporary. That's right.
so it's another kind of we'll see what if there changes. And the thing about the phase out, which is unusual, most times for phase outs they have it half for the single and double for the joint,
Right.
but the phase out's the same for single or joint filers.
That's right. So that's kind of interesting. But that's a big tax savings. So again, you have to be able to itemize to make that work. Seniors getting 46,000. So yeah, it's interesting. We'll see what happens there. Okay, so mortgage interest is capped at 750,000, and $100,000 for home equity. So if you have $1 million+ loan, you can only write off the interest that would be equivalent to 750,000,
Yeah.
assuming you're itemizing.
And so mortgage interest, how much you could do has moved around. Sometimes it's been 500, sometimes it's been $1 million.
Right.
Basically, what it was in 2017, they just made it permanent.
Right.
It's kind of so everyone knows what's going on.
And then there's two car loan interest deductions, one for business and one for personal. So for business, you can do up to 10,000 a year, but they don't have any phase out as far as that goes.
Yeah, there's nothing specific. Unfortunately, for a personal use, any kind of taxpayer, it has to be a U.S. manufactured car, new too, purchased
Yeah.
between 2025 and 2028. There's also phase outs, and it's only on the interest on the car loan, so it's a little bit more kind of niche.
Yeah, exactly. The phase out's 100,000 for single filer and 200,000 for joint. So if you make more than that, it doesn't really matter. But otherwise it might be useful. There's a qualified business income deduction. That's been around for a while. They came out with the 2017, and this is for these
It's basically pass-through entities,
Right.
essentially
LLCs and
LLCs,
subchapter S probably.
yeah, and anything, basically any pass-through business, and so they made it permanent. They increased the thresholds for single and joint if they're in specific trades, like usually the white collar ones, attorneys,
Yep.
there are attorneys, what else? Lawyers, accountants, kind of any kind of financial advisors,
Yeah.
those kind of businesses.
Yep. All right, and then tips. So this is all part of the campaign promises. So you deduct up to 25,000 a year in tips. But again, there is a phase out, 150,000 for single, 300,000 for joint, right?
Yeah, and also with tips, it's only until 2028, and then
Yeah.
so a lot of these have been temporary or kind of short-term provisions.
Yeah, they did the temporary predominantly to make it work, because if they left all of these permanent throughout that 10-year period, the projected, deficit from the bill was 3.3 trillion. I read someplace that if every one of these things stays, which they are likely to stay, actually, more likely to stay than to be phased out, you're looking at like a $5.5 trillion deficit, which they didn't want to sign on for, so they made these temporary, like the SALT and the tip deduction.
It's pretty common for any kind of lowering of taxes that are temporary to become permanent because no one really wants their taxes to go up.
Right.
It's very hard politically to have the capital to push increasing taxes.
That's right, exactly. Overtime pay, same thing, a deduction, 12,500 for single, 25,000 for joint. But again, there is a phase out that starts at 150,000 for single and 300,000 for joint. So that's not, bad, but it's in there. The estate gift tax grew slightly from 13.99 million to 15 million.
Yeah, and then it'll keep growing based on inflation for the rest of their life. So the estate tax was a big thing that a lot of people worried about.
Yeah.
Because estates have become a lot larger, and if they revert back, you might have seen a lot more people needing some sort of A and B trust and stuff like that.
Yes, exactly right. And that was one thing, again, that I think would have stayed no matter which party was there. But that was a big concern, because you go from 14 million, I think it would have dropped back down to about 7 million if they kind of indexed the old number from 2017. And so, it keeps that in place.
Those numbers would cover still a vast majority of the population.
Yeah.
So it's more your niche, high net worth people that are kind of affected by these.
Right. And so now, alternative minimum tax phase out starts at 500,000 single and 1 million for joint. So that, small change there.
Most people don't worry about
No.
ATM. It's a very niche thing.
All right. And then charitable deductions. Now, this is interesting. If you weren't itemizing before, you couldn't take your charitable deductions. You could give away some of your required minimum distributions and not have that count through what's called a qualified charitable distribution, a QCD. But if you weren't over 73 and you still wanted to give to charities, and they weren't giving you a write-off if you weren't able to itemize. And now, no matter whether you're itemized or not, you can do $1,000, a write-off up to $1,000 for charities, and $2,000 for joint, single 1,000, joint is 2,000. So, if you're giving to charities, you can now write off as a couple up to 2,000 of that, no matter whether you're itemizing or not. So you can actually add that on top of your standard deduction, which could be really good. I think this is a nice piece, actually. Then Trump accounts, these are kind of amazing. So I believe these are going to be automatically set up for every child born, from December 1st, 2025 to December 31st, 2028. $1,000 account is going to be set up. It grows tax deferred.
Yeah. And so the nice thing is, as a parent, you can also make a $5,000 contribution yearly. I believe it's also indexed for inflation. And then employers get an annual contribution of $2,500, also indexed. So the nice thing about these accounts is it's a tax deferred account that you can have for your child set up quite early. It's unlike a 529 where you have to have a specific 4-year growth. But I believe these accounts are tax deferred, and they must be in like kind of market rated indexes. And there's rules about how the funds have to be unleveraged. The annual fees can be higher than 0.1%. So it's basically you're going to have passive indexes that are used, which is not a bad thing for these things.
No.
But we'll see as more rules come out.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting piece. It's not a bad thing. Be awful nice to start off, with that as a 0-year-old,
Mhm.
and be able to have some growth and,
Yeah.
what they might be worth at some point in the future when you need them. And so scholarship credit, so this is a new credit for donations to scholarship organizations, so dollar for dollar tax credit. And up to $1,700 a year. Now, tax credit's different than a tax deduction, because a tax deduction, so if I have a $5,000 tax deduction and I'm in the 20% bracket, I see $1,000 disappear
Yeah.
from my tax return. If I have a $1,700 tax credit, I see $1,700 disappear off my tax return.
Yeah, tax credits are very powerful.
Yes.
And they're,
Yeah.
so a lot of people like them.
Yeah, it's not just a deduction. All right, good. So that,
That covers some of the tax bill. There is a lot in those 900 plus pages.
Yeah.
We definitely didn't cover everything, and there's probably a lot more that's going to come out as people start to read through and dig through it.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of different, little twerks. There's always unintended consequences. I know one of the things that got thrown in right at the end was this gambling situation where, you can't write off all of your losses. So if you make 100,000 and you lose 100,000, you don't owe any tax. But now you can only write off 90% of your losses. And so you make 100, lose 100, you still owe tax on $10,000. And so that's a huge deal. And all of a sudden, they're just freaking out because it was thrown in at the very end. And they interviewed some of the senators, and they didn't even know about it, right?
I think that's the problem with a lot of these massive bills is that so many things get thrown in that people don't know actually what's in it.
Yeah, they're supposedly doing a bill now to try to reverse that part of this bill. So there'd be lots of little things that happen as far as that goes. But it's a good question. It's a good thing to start to learn about and understand, how this all impacts your finances. Taxes in retirement are one of the big areas. It's one of the areas that we focus on quite heavily to really try to help people, have a reasonable tax bill as far as that goes throughout their retirement. And so that's a good question. So what's our next question?
So why should the Federal Reserve be independent? And what's the repercussions to the Federal Reserve or just the U.S. economy if is not independent?
Okay, so the Federal Reserve is in charge of lots of different things. We'll talk about monetary policy as the key issue. So they decide what the Fed funds rate should be, right? Which is the rate that can be charged to the biggest institutions, the big banks and what have you. And then that kind of trickles through oftentimes to the rate. So when you see, rates coming down, the Fed coming down, you'll see, overall the rates will come down too, impacts borrowing costs and what have you. Now, everybody on the planet would like really low rates because, why not? I mean, my mortgage is at 2 3/4 because we had some really low rates. I'm pretty excited about that since it started off when I first built the house at 8%. So, it's nice to have that. However, the problem with really low rates is it can create an inflationary environment. And there's probably a couple of reasons why we had a high inflation by end of 2021 and spreading through 2022, specifically with the pandemic and the lack of labor and these different things. But one of the very strong contributing forces was money was practically free, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it
you
got
had low
right.
rates. The government was pumping out lots of money.
Yep.
Just kind of a recipe for inflation.
It is exactly right. So this is where, in this particular case, Donald Trump is trying to get the Federal Reserve to lower rates. I mean, drastically. It's at, 4.25%, 4.5% right now. They usually have a little bit of a range. And he wants to lower it by like 2%, cut it in essentially in
Yeah,
half.
and it would be great for the U.S. because a lot of treasuries are coming due. If the rates are going lower and the market allows the rates to go lower,
Right.
you can get your debt at a cheaper rate or cheaper than current rates.
So from a personal standpoint, from a political standpoint, we want those rates to come down.
Yep.
However, there's a cost to it, and that's this potential for inflation. And so, Ray Alioto, who's a big hedge fund manager, has been running around talking about this is one of the biggest risks we're facing right now, is the independence of the Fed, or the mistake of lowering rates too much in this environment, because they've already got a potentially inflationary environment for two reasons. Tariffs, okay, are inflationary. And we've seen that already in the June CPI report for tariff-related goods that are up even record amounts on a month-over-month basis. And then secondly is these deportations, right? So you've got construction and agriculture and the hotel and restaurant businesses all potentially facing labor shortages, which is going to drive supply down. And if the demand stays the same, you've got an inflationary situation. And so throw in a couple percent less on the tariffs, on the Fed funds rate, and you could end up in a situation where you had this massive inflation spike like we did in the 70s and in the very early 80s. And so that's why the Fed has to stay independent. They need to be able to take a look at that. Now, I will say one thing. I've been watching the Fed a lot. They're one of the most important parts of what I do in terms of analyzing what's happening with the market. Much more important, who the Fed chairman is and how they're reacting than a lot of the other things that are out there. However, they get it wrong all the time.
They're usually late.
They usually are late. Yeah, it's a groupthink thing 'cause they got a board. There's 400 economists working there, and so I think sometimes it seemed pretty obvious they needed to raise rates sooner. Inflation was coming; it was still staying at zero. Unemployment rate was coming down pretty heavily. Mostly related to people just coming back to work after the pandemic. And they didn't, and we ended up with a high inflationary situation. They probably should have started raising rates maybe even 12 months before. And you go the other way, they should have lowered rates earlier. It's always kind of this big panic lowering when everything's falling apart. They'll go back down to zero. However, if politicians are in charge, we're going to have low interest rates, and we are going to have potential for really high inflation, which is very destructive. Whatever money you might save on borrowing costs could be wiped out, by a magnitude of 5 or what have you, by higher prices that you're having to pay.
Yeah, the issue is that politicians don't have the educational background to make these decisions, and the Federal Reserve needs to be independent because they can make unpopular decisions.
Yeah, that's right.
And so being independent protects them in that sense, because they don't have to be reelected, they don't have to repercussions. Politicians do.
Yep. And I think it's a kind of brilliant setup altogether. And they take it very seriously, the dual mandate. Okay, so we want full employment, which is right around that low 4% unemployment. Okay, that's good for them. They're happy with that. And then they want to keep the inflation number, specifically core PCE, inflation report, at around 2%. I think it's about 2.6 or 2.7 right now. And so that lower and up rates, trying to keep those two in balance. And I don't know, even though they've been wrong a lot, it's worked out fairly well. I wouldn't want to see, any president from any party have full control over what's happening with the interest rate picture, because again, we'd probably end up with high inflation at some point, because they all want it lower. Who doesn't? Got midterms coming up or whatever. We want to have kind of this artificial boost, by lowering. But so that's where that independence is there. You take that independence away, it might not lower rates as much as you think, because even if the Fed funds drop, right, you still have the situation where the markets are uncertain about
treasuries aren't
right.
Treasuries aren't by the Fed. They're decided by the market what
That's
rates
right.
are paid.
That's right. Exactly right. They make adjustments in the middle of the auction if they have to, based on what the market is willing to pay, right? That's kind of how it works. So anyway, so that's a good question. It's a good show today. Really looking forward to being able to come again next Friday and send in your questions. So send them in to, ask Tom, talkmoneywithtom.com. And we can try to answer those. And then, of course, if you want to subscribe to the channel, take a look at what's on there, continue your educational process. That would be, I think, a good idea. And then lastly, if you want to just speak with Ethan and I, we can do that too. Just hit the book appointment button up in the corner of our website and set up a time to chat with us. And look forward to being able to see you again next week, and we'll continue to push out the daily videos also for what's happening in the market. All right. Good. Thank you very much.